Hi, I'm Jason, and I work with our young people here at Fairview. This is Grace for Today. We all have been forced to learn and grow accustomed to a new normal, and I think we're tired of hearing that phrase, actually. Some of us have learned a lot about ourselves during this time. There has been so much change to our everyday routine. I don't know about you, but that kind of irks me. I like routine. I like structure. We have had to adjust, rearrange, and just do the best that we can to continue in this way of life. There are some things that have definitely become easier to get used to. For me, it's my wardrobe, not having to go into the office. That's going to be something that is going to be hard to give up. I've definitely gotten used to that. When I think of someone in the Bible that has endured a lot of change, I think you would agree with me. I think of Paul. Paul endured a lot of change in his life, and it is worth noting, even through the change, he remained faithful and constant in his response to the change. How did Paul do that? We actually get a glimpse of how Paul does that and why Paul does that when he addresses the church. When you read any of Paul's writings to the church, he always has something unique to address. There's always some form of change within each particular church that Paul needs to talk about, but before he even begins to talk about that, he always reverts back to the gospel. He always begins by stepping back to remind the church of who God is, what God has done, and now who the church is because of that. Let's take a look at two instances where Paul does just this in Ephesians 1 and Colossians 1. Ephesians 1, in love, he predestined us for adoption to himself as sons through Jesus Christ. In him, you also, when you heard the word of truth, the gospel of your salvation, and believed in him, were sealed with the promised Holy Spirit. Colossians 1, he is the image of the invisible God, and in him, before all things, and in him all things hold together. And through him to reconcile himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. Paul is simply bringing the church back to a foundational truth that is encouraging them to respond not according to what's going on in their life, but according to this truth. I was recently on a conference call. This call was to address a change in a small piece of software because of faults. These faults were identified during the testing of a much bigger piece of software. Someone on the call brought up the term regression testing. They said, do we need to do any regression testing? Now, as a result of this smaller piece of change, is it going to impact what has already been done in this much bigger testing process that we're currently in? Leadership decided that it was not needed to regression test. There was no risk because this smaller piece of software does not impact what actually has already been done. There's no connection between the two. Regression testing is actually rerunning a functional piece of software to ensure that previously developed and tested software still performs after a change. If not, that would be called a regression. This is very similar to what Paul is doing when he writes to the churches. He already knows that whatever the change is that the church is experiencing, the church may be going through something unique to that church, but regardless of that, it is always and it will always be connected to the gospel. So he always takes the church back to what was done. This allows for the best possible perspective for wherever we are now. Whatever the change may be, this realigns our perspective. Reverting back to who God is changes how I think about myself and what is actually going on around me. Paul applies this principle of regression testing by simply taking the church back to who God is, what God has done, and now who they are because of that. This is absolutely necessary if we are to walk by faith. This reminds the believer that they are not simply walking through this change alone, but that they're in fact walking through this change completely embraced and positionally fixed. This is important because no matter what wave of change that we're faced with in our life, we realize that we're positionally fixed, that no amount of storm can blow us apart, blow us away from where God has actually placed us as his child. They are, in fact, walking through this change completely embraced. This reminds us of how much our God has us fixed. In that truth, our response has changed from being based on the circumstances around us to now being based on who God is. Does how we're responding to change in our life reveal that we know the God of the Bible? This is a hard question to ask. This is a great time to ask this question, though. After coming through this season of change, that we're slowly coming out of it, when our response is centered around the change itself, the oppression, or whatever it is that's going on around us, we actually give off the sinking ship vibe. That actually reveals a lack of trust in the God of the Bible. How we actually respond to change reveals a lot about us. It can either reveal that we know God and that we're trusting God, or it can reveal that we're trying to navigate this change alone. Let's learn from Paul as he has reminded the church every time he addresses the church the importance of coming back to the gospel and being reminded of how we are defined, how this change in our life is defined according to God. This has been Grace for today.